to that PO box again and have them lost again.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Mr. Wright. If it helps, we can speak to Mr. Wright outside the inquiry, make sure there's a contact point within the council, and then pass them to Carol and then on to you that way, sir. If that would help, Mr. Wright.
That sounds like a good idea to me, Mr. Linus. Does that work for you, Mr. Wright? Okay, thank you. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going back to something that was brought up this morning, and I just wondered if I could ask some clarification. Excuse me. I think it was Mr. Good that brought up the point of the scale and the grain of the boundary sections that are being considered. Was it that there's a methodology for how the scale of those sections were come up with, or was that a matter for judgment? I think if it's in several instances where you have large pockets of built-up land or large pockets of clearly agricultural or undeveloped land, applying judgment's fine, but where you have a mixture of land uses along one stretch, as the case with one of the sites we're looking at, boundary 1A of section 4, there's built-up land, there's sports pitches, there's built sports development and a healthcare facility, along with meadows and floodplain. That parcel then becomes lumped together, and the larger or the dominant land use, in this case floodplain meadows, is the main element that's assessed rather than the... I appreciate you can't go into a infinitely fine grain on these things, but the impact is that if you lump in developed land with a less developed area, you end up putting parcels of land which shouldn't be put into the green belt.
So perhaps I can deal with that quickly. The answer to the question is it was a question of judgment. The factors that Mr. Robinson mentions would actually illustrate why you do need to exercise judgment depending on where in the boundary you're dealing with, rather than have a strict methodology. So again, this is something which can fall out of the detailed boundary sessions when we're looking at individual stretches.
Mr. Wedgwood.
Thank you, sir. I've got a bit of a problem with the way that it's been done in two stages. So they've first removed a lump of land from the greenbelt, from the general extent of the greenbelt, they're saying now, and then they've done the boundary assessment. So none of that land that was removed in that first stage has been assessed under the boundary setting exercise of the local plan. Now, the general extent of the greenbelt is defined by a regional plan or structure plan. It's not the role of a local plan to define the general extent of the greenbelt. It's the role of the local plan to define the greenbelt boundaries. And in the greenbelt boundary setting exercise, that bit of land isn't included. It's already been excluded. So I've got both a procedural and a substantive issue with this. So the substantive one is really that the way why it's being removed, it doesn't make any sense. So it's being removed on the basis of two pieces of evidence that are both flawed in the evidence base. The first one is the 2003 Greenbelt Appraisal. Now, the 2003 Greenbelt Appraisal is an appalling document, very old now, but it didn't include... What's being stated about this is that it tells you the most important areas of Greenbelt, but doesn't tell you that it's all pieces of important Greenbelt. But even that, I think, is too much to say for this document, because you don't know what sites were assessed to start with, and it outlines a methodology, and then it doesn't score each of the sites. So you don't know what's been assessed, and you don't know what they've scored against the scorings, apart from the ones that they tell you are the most important. So there's no way for anyone to actually double check this information and go back and say, well, was this site included and what were its scores? because the information just isn't there. The council hasn't released it. And this 2003 Greenbelt appraisal is what's feeding. There's two maps on showing the areas of coalescence and something else about areas that should be in the Greenbelt. And they're the only areas that they're considering to be fulfilling Greenbelt purpose, if you like, in there. Now, there's other documents that tell about land within this area that fulfills Greenbelt purpose, like the Heslington Village Design Statement identifies an area of land that prevents coalescence, and a green wedge that protects the rural character of the village and prevents coalescence. Now, that should be a green wedge that's on that map that fulfills Greenbelt purpose, and as far as I can tell, if that was assessed against the criteria, it would score very highly and would be there. But there's no evidence it's either been assessed or of what the scorings were. So I don't know if it's not there because it's wrong, or if it's not there because they never bothered to assess it in the first place. But clearly it should be there, and I'm sure that's just one instance. There could be other things. The second piece of information that they're using, the flawed evidence base, is the 2018 York urban area. Now, I'd just like to give you an analogy to kind of explain the craziness about this. So I'm going to try and prove to you, using dodgy logic, like what the council's using, that York doesn't have a minster. Now, hopefully I won't be successful. But if you were to go down to Low Petergate and look upwards, you would see the grand building that is the minster, and you would, York is famous for it. But we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to take a map of York City Centre. We're going to draw around the building of the minster on that map. We're going to accept that the land inside that has got a high density of minster, but we're not interested in just that. We're interested in the whole area of York City Centre, and the rest of it doesn't have any minsters. So over that entire area, we're going to conclude that there's a low density of minster in York City Centre, which is underneath our cut-off point for minsters, and then we're going to say there's no minsters there. So, I mean, hopefully that's it's crazy. But that's what they've done with the York urban area. They've divided the map into squares. They've then said that we're going to take an average density from GIS data of the density of development in each of those squares. They then said if that density is over a cut-off point, we might, and I'll come back to the might, we might include it into the York urban area. And if it's in the York urban area, it can't fulfill Greenbelt purpose, so it must be removed from the Greenbelt, or the general extended Greenbelt. But what it's not telling you anything about is, firstly, the density, the distribution of the development across those squares. It's an average density. So you could have all of the development in one corner of the square, and a great big piece of land that fulfills Greenbelt purposes, fulfills NPPF Section 80 and PPG 17 open space topology. And that open space is not being considered as an open space that fulfills Greenbelt purpose because it's just being said it's in the York urban area. And I've even provided them the evidence that there's a green wedge there, and they say, oh, it can't because it's in the York urban area, which that's fundamental evidence that tells you there's a piece of land that fulfills Greenbelt purpose. And you wouldn't have supplementary planning guidance approved to say there's a green wedge unless there was a green wedge and it fulfilled that purpose, and yet it's not on the map. And so they tell me that that's not there because it's in this average. You can't take an average figure and say that means that none of the land within that area. They're taking average density and saying it's high, so then they're saying that means that all of that land has got high density of development. It doesn't mean that. And also, it's divided into squares, and there'll be another square next to that. And so it tells you nothing about the relationship. So if there's a bit of open space in one square and some more in the other, then they're contiguous open spaces that actually make a bigger bit that cross the square boundary. And I mean, I reckon you could probably, I don't think they have, but I think they're regularly spaced, but I reckon if you tried to fiddle it, you could actually get rid of the nose, mate. You could make a bit of it on each one and put all the density development on the sides. So I think that basically the Greenbelt
boundary setting exercise bit that they've done, they've already removed a piece of land and then they've never reconsidered that within the boundary setting exercise when it should have been. So within this area will be things that prevent urban sprawl that have lasted for decades, that are the de facto boundaries of the Greenbelt, the things that should be the boundaries, that are just being removed because they're in this urban area designation with no real meaning, and therefore they should be the things that are actually used as the boundaries, but that's being taken out, and then they're coming and defining an artificial boundary of their own design with a pretty poor and weak boundary, which will then get undermined. I think that one of my main issues about the way that they're defining that boundary beyond that is that they're using the metalled surface of roads overly for a great deal of the boundary. Now, the thing about roads is that they are sometimes suitable as Greenbelt boundaries. So if you had a dual carriageway, a fast-moving motorway or something, that would prevent urban sprawl. But when you've got a road, like a general road, where people's driveways go down to it, the presence of the road is actually creating a pressure to develop on both sides of the road because it's connected to the road network and can get further. So by making big sections of the boundary, these metal surface of roads, without a proper consideration of the type of roads and the contribution to preventing urban sprawl of those roads, it's not really giving you a very strong defensible boundary, because it's much more likely that someone will come along and build on both sides of that boundary. And I think, but I can't remember completely, but did it say somewhere that they were designating that strip development wasn't going to be urban sprawl, if I remember? I might have got that bit wrong, but basically I don't think that's a very strong boundary, and I think that some of the things that should have been in that middle bit that were just removed before the boundary was ever considered should have been considered within the boundary setting exercise, because that could have informed the decision about setting the inner boundaries against these, all manner of things, like the geological or historical or whatever, the things that have been protecting the boundary for decades without proper, maybe based on secondary legislation or TPOs or historic monuments, and all this kind of stuff. It should have all been taken into consideration, but they've just removed that and then considered other things, and that doesn't seem right.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wedgwood. Will you be attending the boundary-specific hearings?
I'm only here for today, I think, so I'll watch it on the on the internet.
Well, I shall have to invent my own entertaining analogies in that case.
Oh, is it another time? It's not this time, is it? Is it in section 3? Oh.
In July, yeah.
Oh, I'll try then. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a short break now. I make it 3:13. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 3:30. Thank you.